Are the mobs right? Was America born in shame? Was it an illegitimate and repressive nation from the start? Michael Farris, President and CEO of Alliance Defending Freedom, will answer these questions in We Are Americans. Mike is also founder and chairman of Homeschool Legal Defense Association and Chancellor Emeritus of Patrick Henry College.
Thank you. There was a day, and it hasn't been that long ago, but there was a day when a political or civic leader would extol the genius of the American founding as the beacon of liberty that has not only made this nation great, but has changed the trajectory of the whole world. Such speeches were to be expected, almost trite. Audience would think, well, why don't you tell us something we don't know? But that day is gone. There is an open challenge to this view of America's founding. We're now told that America was born as an illegitimate state. It was founded by white men for white men. People of color were not included in the plans for the American dream. Women were left out of our founding documents and quietly ushered out of the corridors of power. America was born in shame, and it must be all torn asunder so that a new society, a new government, a new culture can rise in its place. That's why we're seeing far more than the removal of Confederate monuments, which, concerning the Confederate monuments, in my humble view, should have never been erected in the first place. But we're not talking merely about that. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson in bronze, destroyed in Portland, Oregon. Statue of George Washington was lit on fire and then pulled down to the ground, again in Portland. Abraham Lincoln, who led the nation in an effort to drive slavery from our shores, has seen his memorial on the National Mall defaced with graffiti. A statue of Ulysses S. Grant, the general who successfully defeated the Confederacy, was toppled in San Francisco. Even abolitionists who were memorialized in bronze were defaced in Philadelphia. If that wasn't a sufficient mix of irony and evil, the first all-volunteer black unit of troops, the Shaw 54th Regiment, had its memorial defaced and damaged in Boston. But the efforts to destroy the story of America's greatness didn't stop there. The memorial to the greatest generation, the brave men and women who fought in World War II and defeated Nazi Germany and the other National Socialist powers of Italy and Japan, that stunningly beautiful site on the Capitol Mall has been defaced as well. These cannot be explained by attacks on racism. The incidents we have before us today are not merely attacks on American history, of course they're that, but they are attacks on the legitimacy of America itself. The forces of Antifa and their radical comrades see themselves as the people who are doing the equivalent of tearing down the Berlin Wall. They see themselves as revolutionary liberators ushering in a new era. The profound irony, of course, and I know I'm maybe getting a little ahead of myself in this story, is that they're seeking to build a new regime on American soil that most closely resembles the views, the goals, the methodology of the Soviet bloc. In reality, they're tearing down the symbols of freedom so that they can fence us all behind a new Berlin Wall. My goal tonight is to analyze their claim that America was born as an illegitimate, repressive nation. I begin with an important observation. America was not born as a perfect nation. It's not perfect today. There is much to be done. And I want to mention very briefly a very personal application of some of that needed work. As I mentioned, we have 26 grandchildren. 3 of them are black. I will almost certainly have more black grandchildren since my son and his stunningly beautiful wife from Nigeria have only one child so far, born on February 29th. If you want to see the cutest baby you can imagine, you need to see our Facebook pictures of Daniel. But they only have one so far, and they intend to have a larger family. Without a doubt, my black grandchildren will face challenges in their lives, both from officials and from private individuals, that my white grandchildren will most likely never face. And that's just not right. It's not acceptable to me, and it shouldn't be acceptable to them, and shouldn't be acceptable to anyone. Yet, acknowledging America's imperfections, as I've just done, is just the starting point for a correct understanding of America's founding. But we need to also understand an important historical detail that seems to be overlooked and misunderstood by many, including the New York Times and its 1619 Project. American colonies may have begun with the Mayflower and Jamestown, but the United States of America arose on July 4th, 1776. The colonial period was certainly influential in the shaping of America, but until we stepped away from the power structure of the colonizers, we were not American citizens. And the claims I am defending are about the United States of America. I make no defense of the British Empire in this continent or elsewhere. I'm an American citizen, looking at our founding documents and examining the nation we have become since our nation was birthed in 1776. The decision to declare our independence was actually made on July 2nd. That was the equivalent of a decision of a young person to move out of their parents' house in the middle of a family fight. But 2 days later, a much more important decision was made. Similar to the decision to get married, the 13 colonies decided to become one nation, the United States of America. The Declaration's authors pointedly explained, that its purpose was to help explain to mankind the reasons that impelled them to the separation from England. And in so doing, they boldly proclaimed the central purpose for the government of the new nation. And that central purpose is embodied in words you've heard many times, including this week. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. 3 fundamental principles were to be at the center of the new nation. All men are created equal. We are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Just governments are based on the consent of the governed. Let me pause and ask an important question. Were any of these things true? Were any of those things a current reality in 1776? No, none of them. Not just inequality, but all of those principles were not where we were as a nation in 1776. It was a description, rather, of where we were going. These were the hopes, the dreams, and the aspirations of a new nation. Full equality was not the only thing that was missing at that moment. Self-government and protection of inalienable rights were also very much in jeopardy. Each of these things lay somewhere in the future, but these dreams were the direction that the founders of our nation were willing to go, should it cost them their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. These were great ideals. Did every one of the founders, every one of the signers of the Declaration live up to the lofty words that they wrote? No. Several were slave owners, including Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. Did the governments that they created, first the Articles of Confederation, and then 11 years after the Declaration, the Constitution of the United States, did these governments immediately fulfill all of these ideals? No. It took until 1791, a full 15 years after the Declaration, just to obtain the Bill of Rights. And it took longer, much longer, painfully longer, to make substantially progress on the promise of equality. But America was not built on the personal fidelity of the founders to these promises. America was built on these core principles themselves. Again, all men are created equal. We're all endowed by God with inalienable rights. Government is to be by the consent of the governed, not just the privileged. All the governed are to consent. These ideals were bigger than the men who wrote them. If you have any knowledge of history, you'll readily recognize that virtually every great leader fails at one time or another to live up to his principles. Moses was utterly instrumental in delivering God's promises and commandments to the children of Israel. Yet Moses ultimately violated these commandments, and God wouldn't let him enter the promised land. Yet there's no doubt of the power of the message of Moses. Peter walked with Jesus, and Peter declared the central truth of the Christian faith. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yet, Peter denied Christ 3 times. Winston Churchill was instrumental in defeating Nazi Germany, and yet he was drunk more often than appropriate, and he frequently insulted Lady Astor. Many other things, I'm sure. Take any leader you want, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, any one of them, and you'll find that they were flawed human beings who did not fully live up to the ideals that they taught and urged us all to follow. Frederick Douglass, a former slave and a critical leader of the anti-slavery movement, about whom I'll have more to say in a few minutes, gave a very balanced assessment of the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence and founded this country. And I quote, "The point from which I'm compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory." Douglass understood. He had a balanced view. The flaws of men do not defeat the profound truths they were responsible for. And the flaws of Thomas Jefferson, serious though they may be, do not overcome the power of his words and actions. All people are in fact created equal, and all of us are endowed by our God with inalienable rights. The story of America shouldn't ignore its flaws. History should not be hagiography, but neither should we overlook the incredible power of the ideals that launched America and our many successes since then. The story of America is a positive one, very positive indeed. Look at where we started, and look at the strides we have made and are continue to make. The ideals expounded in 1776 have been our goal, our guide, and our inspiration for continuous improvement. And at the center of every major improvement upon our government living up to these promises, we will find the ideals of the Declaration, and usually the document itself as inspiration. On May 8, 1790, the Virginia Baptists met in Richmond in convention. This group played an extraordinarily important role in the origins of the Bill of Rights, having extracted a promise from a candidate named James Madison. If he wanted their votes, they got to promise him to change his Federalist views and write a Bill of Rights, including religious freedom. He promised them that to gain their votes and got elected to the first Congress because of it. And we got the Bill of Rights, largely because of that promise. Fresh from their accomplishment with the Bill of Rights regarding the inalienable rights part of the promise of the Declaration, the Baptist group took aim at the second part of the promise of the Declaration, equality. They adopted a resolution in 1790 declaring that slavery, and I quote, is a violent deprivation of the rights of nature and inconsistent with a republican government. And they called upon the people and the legislature to extirpate the horrid evil from the land. A few years later, the Anti-Slavery Convention of 1833 was a catalytic moment in the movement which ultimately led to the Civil War and the eradication of slavery. That 1833 convention issued its own declaration in self-evident reliance upon the Declaration of Independence. They called for the eradication of slavery, to live up to the principles and promises of our founding. Their arguments were compelling and bold. Quote, "No man has a right to enslave or imbrute his brother, or to brutalize his mind by denying him the means of intellectual, social, and moral improvement." We now need to focus for a couple of minutes on Frederick Douglass, a former slave, one of the greatest orators of all time. His speech on this issue is simply something you must read. And I don't say that lightly about much of anything other than my 15 books, of course. But his speech was entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" It is a true classic that will touch nearly everyone with emotions that are almost too powerful. His appeals to the promises of the Declaration of Independence are frequent and impactful. Concerning the promise of the inalienable right to liberty, Douglass proclaims, and I quote, "Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty? That he's the rightful owner of his own body? You've already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply. There's much more, and it's hard to read, but it must be read. I was born in Arkansas, and I've lived in Virginia for more than half my life. My Southern roots are real. But for my entire adult life, I have challenged any person who seeks to defend the South in the Civil War. If you're tempted to think that slavery wasn't that bad and that there were good slave owners, read Douglass's speech. If you want to defend the South and its right to secede on the grounds that it did secede, read his speech. If you think the generals who led the Confederate Army should be celebrated, read that speech. Slavery was an unspeakable evil that rails against every human being's God-given conscience. My 14-year-old grandson, one of my 3 black grandsons, was walking down the street of Purcellville, Virginia, about 20 minutes from here, a little town we live just outside of. A voice from a passing car yelled the singularly most hateful racial epithet at my grandson. That person needs to read Frederick Douglass's speech. Douglass laid the charge at America's feet. You're hypocrites. Your Declaration of Independence demands the eradication of slavery. Your Constitution has no provision that protects slavery, and its great moral thrust is the protection of liberty that denies the legitimacy of slavery. The learned pastors who defend slavery are contradicted by the Bible itself. Douglass closed his speech saying, and I quote again, "Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age." Douglass was not anti-American. He was not anti-founder. He was not anti-declaration. He was not anti-constitution. He was not anti-Christian. He expressed clear belief in the ideals of each of these sources. His call was simple. Live up to the Bible. Live up to the Constitution. Live up to the guarantee of equality and rights proclaimed in the Declaration. Live up to the promise of American freedom. And this has been the same call that many other voices have raised to challenge America to do better. The women's suffrage movement wrote a historic appeal for their causes, and their appeal was fashioned directly on the Declaration of Independence. Their call was the same as Frederick Douglass: live up to the promises of the Declaration of Independence. Even Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of my least favorite presidents, despite the fact that he and I share August 27th as a birthday, and despite the fact that I shook hands with him when I was about 9 years old, about a week before that, I had fed a giraffe at the Portland, Oregon Zoo, and the giraffe licked my hand, and I felt what a giraffe's tongue felt like, and when I shook LBJ's hand at a parade, his hand felt exactly like a giraffe's tongue. And I proved that to my mother, eventually. Despite all these interesting things about LBJ, he's one of my least favorite presidents, and yet, I have to say that his speech that he gave to the nation on July 2nd, 1964, as he signed the Civil Rights Act of that year, that truly advanced racial equality in our country in a very significant way. That speech was truly powerful and inspiring. You should go on YouTube and watch it. And he repeatedly appealed to the promises of the Declaration and said, at long last, we are taking steps to live up to these promises. Every step toward genuine and appropriate equality has been achieved, not by tearing down the Declaration and the premises of America. Rather, it has been a consistent, righteous voice that says we must live up to our own standards. This is not tearing down America. This is not denying the greatness of the American vision, the American founding. This is a call to build on the greatness of our ideals and consistently be the kind of people and nation that our birthright requires us to be. Yes, there's much to be done, and I will return to that thought in a moment. But it's more than appropriate for us to also take stock of how much progress we have made. Slavery was abolished 155 years ago. Equal protection has been a constitutional guarantee for 152 years. These provisions eliminated de jure racism from the governmental sphere, although de facto racism persisted for a good while after that. Brown versus the Board of Education marked the beginning of the end of de facto segregation by government, and that was 66 years ago. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 eliminated the legal framework for segregation and racism in the private economy. De facto problems persisted after that, but lawsuits and societal pressure have made the promises of this 1964 Act the rule rather than the exception, although unfortunately exceptions still persist. But any honest person who's approximately my age recognizes the absolutely radically dramatic societal improvements that we've seen in our country in this area. Take the issue of interracial marriage as a significant example. As recently as 1990, 6 in 10 of non-black Americans said they would be opposed to a close relative marrying a black person. That number has now fallen to 1 in 10. We've come a very long way, and yet there's much to be done. All this stands in stark contrast to what we're hearing from those who are destroying the statues and defaming the American dream. They say America was born in racism and sexism, and worst of all, in view of these critics, it was born in capitalism and was far too Christian. America's founding was illegitimate, and the Constitution was polluted from the beginning, as was the Declaration of Independence. This is the message of the cancel culture. And they aim at more than destroying individuals who stray from their orthodoxies. They aim to cancel our entire national history and rewrite our culture. But while they're at it, they're also attacking individuals. Consider one of their more recent efforts. These are the people who destroyed the career of the director of communications, the Boeing Airplane Company. 33 years ago, he had the audacity, as a young Navy pilot, to write a column that women should not be sent into military combat. This was a perfectly respectable view then, and it is still a perfectly honorable view that many Americans still hold. Again, the chief object of the cancel culture is to use coercion, economic, political, legal, and social, to remake our society and our government into one of their liking. They scoff at the evidence of change over time. They ridicule the idea we're getting better. Any flaw, any failure is fatal. They accept no nuance because, like truth, nuance does not fit their narrative. They've announced their goal to defund and dismantle the police. That's just the tip of the iceberg. They want to dismantle every aspect of the existing power structure that they claim is systemically racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. Their goals are revolutionary and their tactics are always coercive. Any student of socialism knows that it is a violent philosophy that justifies tyrannical uses of power to achieve what it believes to be the greater good. Far too many people fail, to understand the truth about socialism. They need to read Witness by Whittaker Chambers to understand the intrinsic relationship between socialist theories and violent coercion. They need to read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn to see how these theories play out in real life. They need to tour the Romanian orphanages, as I did, just a few weeks after the fall of communism, to see the consequences in real, live human beings of their discredited theories. Today's American radicals have not obtained their beliefs by surfing the internet and being radicalized by foreign socialists. Today's radicals have been taught what they believe by just actually believing what has been in the instruction of the academy for the last 40 years. The events in Seattle paralyzed left-leaning political officials because the officials understood all too well that the radicalized mob was simply acting on what all of that group professed to believe. Let us not think that this is a movement that can be easily shrugged off. With Boeing doing their bidding and the New York Times seeking to further indoctrinate every American student in their philosophy through the 1619 Project, this is a revolutionary movement that must be taken very seriously. This movement has forthrightly declared that it doesn't even believe in the First Amendment, once considered absolutely sacred territory for virtually every American. Catherine McKinnon, University of Michigan Law School, complains that free speech now serves to reinforce and amplify injustice. I quote, "Once a defense of the powerless, the First Amendment over the last 100 years has mainly become a weapon of the powerful." Louis Seidman, law professor at Georgetown, wrote in the Washington Post, "When I was younger, I had more of the standard liberal view of civil liberties. What I have come to see is that it's a mistake to think of a free society as a free speech as an effective means to accomplish a more just society. At its core," he says, "free speech law entrenches a social view at war with key progressive objectives." And we see this view in operation every day. When there are calls to destroy the Goya Food Company because its CEO dares to say something nice about President Trump, we see that the cancel culture is extraordinarily serious. They do not believe in the old adage, "I may disagree with everything you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it." That one statement sums up American philosophy as well as any other. People who reject freedom of speech for all reject the essence of what it means to be an American. I would submit that we cannot gain victory over this movement through politics as usual, even though such efforts are entirely needed. We must counter their efforts to force their philosophy on this country by powerfully demonstrating the superiority of our own revolutionary philosophy. That philosophy derived from the revolution launched in 1776. The way forward must be built on the principles of our founding. The time has come for a clear and unmistakable defense of the legitimacy of our founding ideals: equality for all, inalienable rights for all, and rule by the consent of the governed. These ideals arise from a moral view of the world that shines far more brightly than anything the other side can offer. But as we defend our ideals, we need to defend them all. We cannot protect God-given rights unless we're also committed to equality. And we cannot achieve equality without protecting God-given rights. And there are some rights that are particularly at risk today, and we must strongly defend each one, even as we advance equality. The right to life from conception to natural death, the freedom not to just to believe what we want about God, but to exercise our religious beliefs in everyday life, a freedom that is for all people of all faiths. The freedom of all people to speak messages I don't like, and my freedom to speak messages other people don't like. Property rights, Second Amendment rights, and other protections of the Bill of Rights must also be zealously protected. And we must insist on governmental compliance with the principle of self-government, one of the three fundamental foundations of this nation. No one except the people and their elected legislators can make law. We must demonstrate that the market economy has not only been a powerful engine for prosperity, it has been the vehicle which has made it possible for the outpouring of unparalleled acts of charity that flow from the Christian duty to help those in need. The denial of self-government has been seen very, very clearly with edicts from governors substituting their personal decisions and whims for properly enacted laws. The rules of the Constitution must be observed at all times, even in emergencies. And this includes the rule that only legislators can make law. We're living at a precipitous moment in our nation's history, and we have to choose one of two revolutionary paths. One path promises utopia, but will deliver coercion and mediocrity. The other path, following the revolution of 1776, will deliver imperfections, improvements, and freedom. As for me, even with imperfections, I choose the American dream of equality, God-given rights, and self-government. America started with a dream of liberty in a land rife with difficulties. We still have difficulties, and we must absolutely strive to improve. But we must not be the people that relinquish the American promise. We are created equal. We are endowed by God with inalienable rights. We will pursue equality. We will insist on our rights. We will stand strong for freedoms. We are Americans. Thank you.